When I started to study the Silver Age, I was a graduate student at the University of Toronto, and at that time, 2 out of 3 graduate students, not at the University of Toronto, but worldwide, were writing something on the Silver Age. I think that this interest in the Silver Age is now in decline, and I think that I can explain why. I chose Mikhail Larionov's Reclining Soldier because wars and revolutions in the 20th century, they played a considerable role in shaping up this cultural construct, the Silver Age. So just a few words about the outline of my talk. My central thesis is that the Russian Silver Age is not so much the period itself as the ways in which it has been remembered, conceptualized, and commemorated. I will start by saying a few words about the history of the term. I will then describe briefly the cultural scene in Russia prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, known as the Russian Silver Age. I will show that the Silver Age as a cultural construct came into being in 1937, coinciding with the 20th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. By then, the Silver Age had acquired its privileged outsideness and strangeness. I will talk briefly about its makers and undertakers. I will talk about the image of the Silver Age in the 1960s, 1980s. I will argue that the Silver Age as a construct was instrumental in helping Russian writers, Russian intellectuals, and the public at large to cope with the existential anxieties unleashed by the Bolshevik Revolution, Stalinist terror, Khrushchev's thaw, and Gorbachev's perestroika in the 20th century Russia. Well, just to remind you about the origin of the term the Silver Age, and it comes from the Greek poet Hesiod, and I borrow this concise definitions of different ages of man from Wikipedia. So Golden Age, peace and harmony prevailed during this age. Humans did not have to work to feed themselves, for the earth provided food in abundance. They lived to very old age, but with a youthful appearance, and eventually died peacefully. The Silver Age. Men in the Silver Age lived for 100 years under the dominion of their mothers. They lived only a short time as grown adults and spent that time in strife with one another. During this age, men refused to worship the gods, and Zeus, don't see this, and Zeus destroyed them for their impiety. Bronze Age. Men of the Bronze Age were hardened and tough, as was their purpose and passion. Heroic Age is the one age that does not correspond with any metal. It is also the only age that improves upon the age it follows. It was the heroes of this age who fought at Thebes and Troy. And the final age is the Iron Age, and Hesiod believed that that was the age he lived in. These are illustrations from Lucas Cranach, the Elder. So this is how he pictured the Golden Age, and this is how he pictured the Silver Age. You see the differences. And so the last age is the Iron Age. During this age, humans live an existence of toil and misery. At the height of this age, humans no longer feel shame or indignation at wrongdoing. Babies will be born with gray hair, and the gods will have completely forsaken humanity. There will be no help against evil. So the term Silver Age was coined in the 1910s, and at that time it was used in a derogatory sense, something that was inferior to the so-called golden age of Pushkin, Lermontov, Tuchev, and Tolstoy. Nowadays, the term Silver Age is often employed to denote loosely a period in Russian cultural evolution that ended with the advent of Bolsheviks in 1917. What is generally known as the era of modernism in Western cultures, 1890 to 1939, is frequently divided into the blossoming Silver Age, the flourishing of the arts in the years immediately preceding the revolution, and the decaying age of socialist realism, the sterile formations of the arts in the late 1920s and beyond. For years, the Silver Age was one of the most intensely studied topics in Russian cultural studies, and for years, scholars struggled with its precise definition. Many literary scholars, both within and without Russia, still see Russia's Silver Age as a charmed lost era or as a historical period in cultural evolution on a par with Romanticism and the Enlightenment. In her essay, Pushkin's Children, written in 1992, the writer Tatiana Tolstaya describes the Silver Age as the legendary time and as the Titanic floating in the night and gloom on its way to destruction. Quote, during the years before the revolution, the arts flourished in an extraordinary manner. Now, when we look back with a feeling of sorrow and loss at that legendary time, which seems separated from us by a transparent but impassable barrier, when we hear the dim underwater voices of those people, their debates and quarrels, their amorous admissions, their unrealized and realized prophecies, we have a vision of the Titanic floating in the night and gloom on its way to destruction. A vision of a huge ship brightly illuminated, full of music, wine, and elegant people, a bit afraid of the long ocean voyage, of course, but hoping that the journey will end well. After all, the ship is so large, strong, and reliable, unquote. So the Silver Age is characterized by the blossoming of all arts, religious and philosophical thought in late imperial Russia. So this is the list, rather incomplete, of different movements, of different art school. You can read it. You can read this list. I will discuss some of these groups in more detail, particularly acmeists and formalists. So some artists creatively combined different approaches, and they belonged to different schools. So you see the paintings by Aristarch Lintulov. He was a representative of Cubism, Cubofuturism, Post-Impressionism, Fauvism, and Orphism. You see his self-portrait, his Sky Bell, and this is his most famous painting of Saint Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. And you can see that he succeeds in showing the cathedral from different perspectives, from different points of view. Prior to the revolution of 1917, artists enjoyed unprecedented freedom to portray and live the reality the way they wanted. Here is Mikhail Larionov and two of his paintings, his self-portrait and his Russian Venus. This is his Summer from 1912 and A Happy Autumn from 1912. Those of you who are not familiar with this period or with this artist, you wouldn't guess that his main source of inspiration were Russian icons. Again, people were allowed to do whatever they wanted with their sources of inspiration and mold them to meet their agenda. You see some examples of this fin de siècle aesthetics or Art Nouveau in architecture. These are the same building in Moscow that was built by the architect Shechtel, who was a friend of Anton Chekhov and particularly his brother Nikolai. And this is another building in Moscow, which was a replica of some Spanish cathedral. Both buildings haven't changed and you can visit them nowadays. So the beginning of the 20th century enjoyed the revolution in theatrical art, in theatrical design and stage costumes. Leon Bakst was the most important person in this particular group. You see his design for Scheherazade that was composed by Rimsky-Korsakov, who was the teacher of Igor Stravinsky. And these are the new costumes that Bakst designed for Sergei Digilev's performance. You've had a lecture on Igor Stravinsky and his rapport with Sergei Diaghilev and his group that is known as Ballet Russe. So Diaghilev staged Stravinsky's Firebird a few years prior to staging Rite of Spring. The Firebird introduced a new concept of Russian people. They were seen as primitive, naive, exotic, and Diaghilev decided that this line of appropriating a foreign culture, in this context, Russian culture, should continue. So he asked Stravinsky to write music for another ballet, which showcases Russian pagans and their welcoming spring. And one of their rituals is sacrificing a young maiden so that spring would turn to be warm and prosperous. This was quite a scandal. The French ballet lovers didn't enjoy this production, but it didn't stop Stravinsky and Diaghilev's cooperation, but it's probably the most scandalous performance of the Fandesieklian period in Russian culture. So literature, Russian futurists, the most prominent representative of that movement is Vladimir Mayakovsky. He wrote his long poem, A Cloud in Trousers, and he and his friends, they came up with their manifesto, which is called A Slap in the Face of Public Taste. The most important thing is that they invited other artists to throw Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy overboard from the ship of modernity. Most Russian people, they know this phrase, throw Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and many others overboard from the ship of modernity. So this was still the time where writers were allowed to compete with one another. So Pushkin was seen as a predecessor and as a rival. But in the late 1920s, Mayakovsky wrote his famous dialogue with Pushkin, in which he claimed his allegiance with Pushkin and his admiration, being so happy that in the Russian alphabet, Mayakovsky and Pushkin, their names started with letters that would follow one another. P, Pushkin, would follow M, Mayakovsky. This is the young Mayakovsky in his futuristic attire. So in literary studies, young literary scholars who came to be known as Russian formalists, they also came up with their own manifestos. One of them was called The Resurrection of Word. They were the first to downplay the role of writers' biographies or the role of details of their private lives. They declared it completely unimportant as compared to the actual literary texts and their structures and characteristics. So just a few words, a few quotes from Terry Eagleton, who describes Russian formalists. Literature is not pseudo-religion or psychology or sociology, but a particular organization of language. Literature has its own specific laws, structures as devices, which are to be studied in themselves rather than reduced to something else. The literary work is neither a vehicle for ideas, a reflection of social reality, nor the incarnation of some transcendental truth. It is a material fact whose functioning could be analyzed rather as one could examine a machine. So formalists were the ones who discovered defamiliarization in the works of Tolstoy. Although I believe that this concept, defamiliarization, making familiar things look and sound unfamiliar, is applicable to all art, because not only literature refreshes our habitual responses and renders objects more perceptible, but works of music, painting, sculpture also refresh our habitual responses and render objects more perceptible. Many formalists were friends of the female poet Anna Akhmatova, one of the four acmists, and they wrote numerous articles analyzing her poetry and also talking about the foreseeable future when her works were going to be celebrated as the best examples of Russian poetry. So I decided that I would talk briefly about Akhmatova's poetry that she wrote prior to the revolution and see how her image and how her poetic persona changed with time. I think that on my lecture poster, Anastasia chose this particular image of Akhmatova. This is an earlier drawing by Amadea Modigliani. Akhmatova and Modigliani met in Paris during Akhmatova's trip to Europe with her husband, Nikolai Gumilev. They fell in love and Akhmatova posed for him. She was very much unaware of him becoming a celebrated artist until much later. So this is her poem, which consists of 7 lines, which she wrote on November 9 in 1910, shortly after her marriage to Nikolai Gumilev. This is Nikolai Gumilev, and this is one of his collections of poems, which is called Pearls. Gumilev, at that time, he went on one of his expeditions. He was a poet, a distinguished poet by the time he married Akhmatova. He was a traveler. He was a dreamer. So she was not desperately in love with him when she married him. He had a duel prior to proposing to her, and it made him comparable to Alexander Pushkin, who was famously killed during his fatal duel in 1937. So she thought that she was marrying a great poet, which is the way people describe Gumilev now, but that's not exactly what she thought at the time. So I will read it out loud. He loved 3 things in life: evensong, white peacocks, and old maps of America. He hated it when children cried. He hated tea with raspberry jam and women's hysterics. ... And I was his wife. So you see that we can divide this 7-liner into 3 distinct parts. The first 3 lines describe his likes, which do not include anyone but the poet himself. White peacocks were a rarity, so you had to travel somewhere to see them. And old maps of America would also hint at Gumilev's desire to be elsewhere, although they also make him sound a very interesting person, because in those days traveling to America was almost impossible. And when you read Dostoevsky and his characters talk about America, America is a euphemism for committing suicide. So when the brothers Karamazov discuss Dmitri's trip to America, in fact, what they're talking about is suicide. So old maps of America, white peacocks, these were all scenes that were not readily available in Russia. Even some church services, which one attends, takes part with the community. But again, there is a feeling that he goes there alone. So the next three lines, they describe scenes that he didn't like, and the translation is wrong in the sense that he didn't hate. In Russian, не любил, he didn't like. So he didn't like it when children cried. He didn't like tea with raspberry jam and women's hysterics. So this is the second portion, again, consisting of only three lines. And so these are all scenes related to family life. And one can ask what is wrong with not liking when children cried. I also don't like when children cried. I yet have to see a person who likes when children cry. But the second line is more ominous. He hated tea with raspberry jam. And on the list of Russian home remedies, tea with raspberry jam is right at the top. So tea with raspberry jam is an equivalent of chicken soup in the US. So the fact that he didn't like tea with raspberry jam would signal his inability to accept his wife as a caregiver. He didn't need anyone's help. He was completely independent. Well, women's hysterics, this is a very strong way of describing it. Again, very few people like women's hysterics, and yet the narrator uses it against a he in this poem. And the last line, and I was his wife. So now she reveals, the narrator reveals her role in this relationship. So she was his wife. And I have been thinking for a number of years, why would she say, and I was his wife? Why would she use past tense, and I was his wife? And I think that the past tense implies that her social standing had changed at that point, and that she was no longer a wife of a reasonably famous poet with all his quirks and whims, but she could stand on her own. She was an established poet herself. The ellipses only highlight this rift. The marriage lasted a few more years, but in her marriage poems, Akhmatova discovered ways of containing her husband, something that she couldn't do in real life. This is one of her very first poems, and yet you can see that she was a real master, because those of you who've read Anna Karenina, it is about 800 pages long. You can easily turn it into a 7-line poem. because here we have the tragedy of a marriage, which is full of mishaps and misunderstandings. And it was very hard for a female poet or a female writer to succeed prior to the end of the 19th century. There were some female writers, and we know that Catherine the Great, she was also writing some mediocre historical plays. There were some female writers in the 19th century, but very few people remember their names, while the name of Anna Akhmatova or Marina Tsvetaeva or Sofia Parnok, these were three female poets. They are extremely well known, not only in Russia, but all over the world. So for a female writer to succeed prior to the beginning of this Silver Age, she needed several scenes. One was a sufficient a sufficient independent income, plus, to borrow Virginia Woolf's definition, a room of her own, which very few women had at the time. Plus, they needed a man who would serve as a mediator and who would provide introductions. So in part, Akhmatova married Gumilev so that she would be associated with a male poet whose name was known to a group of readers with a developed sense for reading great poetry. The other thing that Akhmatova does in this particular poem is that she teaches women how to formulate their discontent, how to talk about their family life. Because before, women were only the objects of male adoration. They were shown as wives, mothers, and muses, most often than not. But they were always silent. They were not allowed to say a word about how they felt and whether they were content with the life they were dealt. When Gumilev came back from his trip, he actually praised Akhmatova for her poems, and he encouraged her to publish them as soon as possible. So he didn't object to being portrayed in this rather unflattering light. And just to show you some other poems that she also wrote in conjunction with this one. This is a very famous poem because many female readers, they took it at face value. They thought that she was describing the actual scene that took place in the narrator's home. My husband whipped me with his woven belt, folded in two. All night I've been at the little window with a taper waiting for you. Well, I don't need to explain that Gumilev never whipped Akhmatova with his woven belt. But this was the time when everything went, everything was possible, and people didn't really care whether it had any truth to it. This is another poem that she wrote for a place, for a cave where she and her friends like to gather in the evenings. And that's how she describes her companions. We're all drunkards here, harlots. How sad it is for us together. Flowers and birds on the walls are pining for the clouds. You smoke a black pipe. The smoke above it is so strange. I put on a tight skirt to seem even slimmer. And when she was 40, and of course, when critics, Soviet critics, were writing about her, these were the lines that they would recall, completely ignoring all her later poetry, which was not about drunkards and harlots, but this is just an illustration of how she saw herself or wanted to be seen by her readers. And she was wildly popular with many female readers. They really felt that they had that her poems provided fresh air, and now they know what to do. It was like a programmatic statement, which some people wanted to follow in their own life. So this is another famous poem prior to 1917. So this is the second year of World War I. And you see Gumilev, he was at the front, and this is a very short visit. The picture was taken at a studio, and in the middle is their only son. So here is Akhmatova. Give me better years of sickness, suffocation, insomnia, fever. Take my child and my lover and my mysterious gift of song. This I pray at your liturgy after so many tormented days, so that the storm cloud over darkened Russia might become a cloud of glorious days. And again, one has to be very careful about what one is asking for. This was the first poem that Gumilev really hated, and he became very offended by the fact that she was prepared to give up her child and her lover and her mysterious gift of song. And everything actually came into being because Akhmatova fell silent for over 13 years, from 1924 to 1937. Gumilev met a very tragic death, and their son, he spent several years in prison. He fought during World War II, then he was sent to Stalin's gulag, so his life was not all roses. So this is Akhmatova, who wants to be larger than life, being unfair to people who were close to her, but that was her poetic persona. This is a contemporary sculpture of Akhmatova talking to Gumilev. It was made in 2001. So this is one of those conversations that they didn't have while Gumilev was alive. Gumilev was one of the first victims of the Bolshevik terror. Akhmatova, she revealed to her confidants, had been tortured ever since Gumilev's execution in 1921 by the guilt of not having loved him enough. This feeling of moral responsibility for the dead and forgotten and forbidden, some of whom were intimately related to her, made her a perfect keeper of the pre-revolutionary cultural tradition. In the 1920s and 1930s, Akhmatova became the sole custodian of Gumilyov's legacy and supervised the work of Pavel Luknitsky on the first biography of Gumilyov. So you could see changes by looking at these two portraits that were executed by the same artist, Yuri Panenkov. So here is Akhmatova, maybe with her female friend Sudekina. By most accounts, Akhmatova was bisexual. And this is the same Akhmatova looking very sober and living through a difficult period in Russian history. And this portrait dates back to 1923, I think. No, 1921. Now let's talk about the role of the Bolshevik Revolution in creating the Silver Age's unblemished legacy. How do we know that this or that period of cultural evolution has come to an end? Did modernism really end with the outbreak of World War II, as we're now led to believe? Do we always become aware of the end of an era as a result of a meaningful political event or the death of a major figure? All histories of cultural evolution have made use of historical events, some bringing them to the foreground, some moving them to the background, but none have been able to ignore them entirely. Do political events punctuate cultural shifts, or do the shifts turn minor happenings into major historical events? These are not easy questions to answer. One question for which we might want to seek an answer is how political and cultural phenomena are built into contexts that endow them both with a codependent meaning. Alexander Blok, he was a major poet of the Silver Age. He also died in 1921 when he was only 40 years old. He died in his own bed. And he wrote two poems. One is a long poem, The 12, and another one is Seasons in 1918. And then he fell silent and didn't write one poetic line after that. This is Blok with his wife. His wife was Mendeleev's daughter. They were madly in love with one another, but Blok decided to treat his life as a cultural project. So this relationship was never consummated to the grief of his wife. So instead of spending time with his wife, he would go to Brussels. And there were many life creation projects that went sour, with only one notable exception. So this is Blok's 12, one of his last poetic works. This is an illustration by the very same Anenkov. You remember his portraits of Akhmatova. So this was his attempt at processing the historical and social impact of the October Revolution, and he sincerely, at that time, he wanted to see the good side of the revolutionary events. So he portrayed this 12 rioting workers, like 12 apostles who are raiding the streets of Petrograd, the name of Petersburg that was given to Petersburg during the First World War I. Again, the illustration of Yuri Anenkov, and we learn that the group of 12 revolutionaries, they were led by no one but Jesus Christ himself. This poem provoked heated debates. Many literary critics, poets, and representatives of Russian intelligentsia, they couldn't understand why Blok would choose Christ as the leader of this despicable group of people who wouldn't think before killing another human being, which happens while they're walking the streets of Petrograd. Despite the occurrence of many deaths at that stressful time, Blok's burial and funeral service attracted a large congregation of intellectuals. Everyone felt good about going there, about being there. Many were mourning their pasts, the whole stretch of their artistic lives, and maybe also their own imminent death. This is a quote from Mikhail Kuzmin. Other memories chose to concentrate on Blok's physical appearance by highlighting his inability to breathe, eat, see, and even hear during the first years of the Soviet regime. Although it was easy to attribute those impediments to Blok's poor physical state and to the hard living conditions that most people endured at the time, the majority of memories preferred to interpret them metaphorically as a sign of Blok's inability to function normally in the Bolshevik-controlled environment. Nadezhda Pavlovich, for some reason, was under the impression that Blok died on the threshold of a gigantic new period that he was about to embrace. She felt that somewhere at a great depth, everything inside him had undergone a considerable transformation, but none of his friends, relatives, or his wife were aware of it. Of course, Blok's death didn't go unnoticed, and it was used as an illustration by Leon Trotsky in his famous study, Literature and Revolution. Trotsky felt that the revolutionary nature of the October events manifested itself most clearly in an all-consuming cultural rejuvenation. A profound break in history, that is, a rearrangement of classes and the society, shakes up individuality, establishes the perception of the fundamental problems of lyric poetry from a new angle, and so saves art from eternal repetition. Unquote. In other words, if what happened in October 1917 was indeed a revolution, then it should have been accompanied by a revolution in literature and in culture. If there is no evidence of a great cultural upheaval, then what happened was not a revolution. As I have already mentioned, Blok was a perfect case to study because he died in his own bed. He was a highly prolific and well-known poet, beloved by all those in Russia who can read. And he was only 40 years old. His premature death made him, in Trotsky's eyes, a concrete manifestation of tectonic changes taking place in post-revolutionary Russia. Quote, "To be sure, Blok is not one of ours," writes Trotsky, "but he reached towards us, and in doing so, he broke down," unquote. So he reached towards us, and in doing so, he broke down. So that was a perfect position in Trotsky's eyes. And he proceeds by describing other living writers as dead and obsolete. Although in the 1910s, there were already signs that the ascetic or the Silver Age tradition would gradually fade away from the literary scene, this is not how its closure came to be remembered. This was largely due to the catastrophic shock that was impressed on the Russian populace by the October Revolution. In the late 1910s, the long prophesied and welcomed apocalypse turned into a somber reality. In an atmosphere of disorder and depravity, the death of ascetic cultural tradition was no longer just a metaphor, but a fact of everyday life. Either Russian degenerate intellectuals were literally dying out one after another, or they fled the country or were forced to immigrate in the fall of 1922. The Bolshevik Revolution shook all those institutions that had been responsible for the preservation of continuity and the transmission of cultural traditions, such as the church, schools, the family, and the state. Furthermore, many artifacts, periodicals, publishing houses, exhibition halls, apartments, buildings, estates, restaurants, cabarets, theaters, and even cities, all of which came to be associated with the Silver Age and which constituted some kind of a repository of its culture, would soon change beyond recognition, stop functioning, or cease to exist. Blok's beloved family estate Shakhmatovo would be one of the first estates to be destroyed by rioting peasants, and St. Petersburg would change its name twice within 6 years to become the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution. Although the years 1917 and particularly 1921, the year of Blok's and Gumilev's deaths, were immediately recognized by many as the closure of an entire epoch in Russian culture, not many people at that time saw it as an irreparable loss. Moreover, when the Bolsheviks started campaigning against the cultural heritage of their immediate past, their iconoclastic slant was in fact shared by a number of intellectuals who were by that time greatly disillusioned with Russian literature and culture, blaming it, as did the writer and philosopher Vasily Rozanov, for leading to general confusion and unrest. According to Rozanov, Russian literature, in terms of its main themes, was such a loathsome sin because it was traditionally preoccupied with only how they loved and what they talked about, instead of guiding and educating people. So I have several examples of how former representatives of the pre-revolutionary culture, they turned away from the culture that nurtured them, and they started to criticize the time and its representatives rather violently. One also need to keep in mind that many representatives of the Silver Age, like Marxists, they were longing for radical changes in human nature and social order, which they associated not so much with political revolt as with the creative potential of human beings manifested in two areas of human activity, art and love. In 1922, the leading symbolist, the poet Valery Brusov, commented on the state of Russian poetry. We are not talking here about the reevaluation of the poet's talents. Rather, we're referring to a comparative evaluation of poets' contributions during different periods. If at the end of the 19th and at the beginning of the 20th centuries, the works of symbolists had constituted literary milestones, then over the last 10 years, they have been received as bibliographical curiosities, some of which, alas, evoked scenes that we had read before. The poet Zinaida Gippius, when she needed to debase Brusov in 1923 for his compliance with the Bolsheviks, she declared him dead both as a human being and a poet. Brusov hasn't died physically, but because of his current position in Bolshevik Russia, I can, with a clear conscience, consider him dead as a person, dead for me and for the majority of Russians. There can be no meeting between him and me on earth. I should also add that Brusov is dead as a poet. I find that natural and logical. I don't think it could have been otherwise. I refer those who doubt it to his recently published book of poetry, which is not only bad, but also not quite probable, i.e., illiterate. So many famous representatives of the so-called Silver Age, they criticized the pre-revolutionary Russia, its culture and its representatives. What was particularly interesting that even Lydia Ginsburg, well, who like Khodasevich is known for her integrity, but in an entry, she attested to the complete dissolution of Silver Age men and to the advent of a physically, psychologically, and socially more adept men of the 1930s. And the beat tone of her entry suggests that she was welcoming this transformation, not criticizing it. It was almost as if a certain organ that was responsible for accommodating the complexity of styles, methods, and approaches suddenly became atrophied in many men of the 30s, so that they could no longer appreciate anything that was not simple and straightforward. To paraphrase the cultural anthropologist Clifford Geertz, it seems as if they had suddenly lost the appropriate skills and experience of living a Silver Age life and rapidly stopped seeing scenes in a Silver Age way. By the early 1930s, because of the joint activity of many Russian intellectuals, both those residing in the Soviet Union and those living abroad, the Silver Age was excluded from what were then the approved boundaries of Russian culture. It was excluded along with everything for which it stood, an unprecedented degree of experimentation in all spheres of art and life, individualism, and a determined rejection of traditional moralizing. In other words, its legacy was openly rejected both by its very representatives and by its rightful heirs. Clearly, one could not blame the Bolsheviks alone for the prevailing critical vision of pre-revolutionary culture in the 1920s and 1930s. Such critical appropriations of the past were part of the zeitgeist. However, by 1937, the expectations of reaching the golden age, be it the communist paradise or the new spiritual renaissance, had worn thin, and the mythological era of original happiness and prosperity was again identified as having occurred in the immediate past. Apparently, the 20th anniversary of the October Revolution in 1937 was all at once identified by many as a point of no return to the pre-revolutionary past. In Pierre Nara's terms, it was around that time that the Silver Age had stopped being taken for granted and started to be perceived as a lieu de mémoire, because there were no longer milieux de mémoire, settings in which memory was a real part of everyday experience. In such a situation, it became more important to preserve what was left than to attack or rebel against it. In the 1930s, many Russian intellectuals came to praise and admire the Silver Age and to blame the Bolsheviks for its interruption. In his remarkable study, Anxiety and the Formation of Early Modern Culture, William Bomswa hypothesized that any culture is the product of man's ability to impose a meaning on his experience that can give to life a measure of reliability and thus reduce, even if it cannot altogether abolish, life's ultimate and terrifying uncertainties, unquote. I submit that the Silver Age is a cultural construct of retrospective origin, which was brought to life as a means of overcoming the existential anxieties unleashed by the Bolshevik Revolution, the Civil War, and the Stalinist terror. The initial vision of the Silver Age as that of a period associated with decadence and art for art's sake, aesthetics, in fact, has remained intact. What changed in the late 1930s was that as a result of its subsequent reconstructions, the Silver Age received a new set of characteristics in addition to the old ones. Among the most important ones was its strengthened interlocked destiny with the October Revolution. Of course, the Silver Age and the Revolution have been seen as interconnected phenomena since the late 1910s. However, if at that time the Silver Age had been presented as paving the road to the Revolution, then in the late 1930s it became represented as having been terminated by the revolution. In other words, although the Silver Age is often referred to as the Russia we lost forever, its forfeiture had to be engineered. To account for such abrupt changes in the presentation of the pre-revolutionary culture, we have to ask what happened to the image of this period in the 1920s and 1930s that later not only redeemed it in the eyes of its various beholders, but covered it with a patina of respect and admiration. As I have shown, in only 20 years, the overall perception of pre-revolutionary culture underwent a crucial transformation. It was no longer perceived either as ours or as an integral part of the Russian cultural heritage. And it was this quality of strangeness which the Silver Age rapidly acquired in the eyes of numerous beholders that was ultimately responsible for its almost imminent rediscovery and subsequent glorification. As Mikhail Bakhtin perceptively observed, quote, "In the realm of culture, outsideness is a most powerful factor in understanding," unquote. We might add that outsideness is also the most powerful factor that instigates the creation of cultural memory. The fact that 20 years is indeed an extremely short period with regard to cultural history becomes evident if we recall how many years, centuries to be more precise, it took for the modern world to rediscover ancient Greece, for the English to rediscover Shakespeare, or for the French to feel the urge to resurrect Joan of Arc. know that I have been talking for more than 60 minutes. So I think that I will stop soon. I will just mention that because many representatives of the Silver Age met tragic deaths, they were executed or were forced out of the country, then the battling with the representatives of the previous tradition was strictly forbidden. And with Anna Akhmatova, she became the loving wife of Nikolai Gumilev. She loved him more after his death than when he was alive. And as much as she wanted to criticize Alexander Blok, for example, she couldn't do it openly. So this photograph I took in Anna Akhmatova's museum, this is the room that she occupied with her third husband, Nikolai Punin. This was a communal apartment. He couldn't bear to separate with his first wife and a daughter, so they all continued to live under the same roof, plus Akhmatova's son, Lev Gumilev, who was a teenager at the time. Then 2 rooms were given to other people, the Smirnovs. So it was a typical Soviet communal apartment. This was just 1 room where Akhmatova lived with Gumilev. So she used this experience of living in a communal apartment to explain the mentality of many representatives of the Silver Age. For example, she would describe Blok as a very weak person with a communal apartment mentality. And if someone like Lydia Chukovskaya, who was a specialist on Russian literature, would question this particular definition, Akhmatova would just point to the adjacent wall, and she would say that I know what I'm talking about. Her other way of dealing with representatives of the previous generations was to criticize their wives, because she wouldn't dare to criticize their texts. So she would criticize their choice in women. And there are several other strategies that she used, and she was quite creative in that way. So in the 1980s and 1990s, there was quite a boom of interest in the Silver Age. So many Russian intellectuals and just Russian readers at large, they became aware of their political and cultural history. So the Silver Age in those days became a popular symbol of democratic development and of moral and artistic freedom. Until recently, the Silver Age occupied a unique place in Russia's collective memory. Its distinct position as a pariah and an enigmatic other prevented it from turning into a realm of memory par excellence. It has always been a sleeping volcano rather than an extinct one. What happens to cultural constructs such as the Russian Silver Age when they lose one of their important constituent elements, their delectable outsideness, foreignness, and novelty? So this is the screen, which says the Silver Age in 22 minutes. So this is an advertisement for a lecture. which in the 1980s was completely unthinkable. One would have needed several hours to talk about the Silver Age. On November 4th, 2005, Russia for the first time celebrated Day of Popular Unity, although not everyone was aware of the exact historical events that made this particular day more memorable than others. Most newspapers had to provide short or extended explanations that this was the day Moscow was liberated from the Poles in 1612. This date was chosen by Putin and his government to supplant and erase another red date in the calendar, November 7, which for many years had been celebrated as the official annual commemoration of the Bolshevik Revolution. To conclude, the Bolshevik Revolution is currently being erased from the political and cultural maps of the 20th century Russia, while the all-pervasive and fundamental cultural role of the Silver Age is being downplayed. Up till now, the revolution of 1917 has been seen as the main enemy of the Silver Age. However, the Silver Age, like the mysterious Atlantis to which it is often compared, might sink into oblivion, not because of the revolution, but together with the revolution. Thank you very much.
The first interesting question that I received is from Douglas. Does the term Silver Age carry the historic implication of a golden age of Russian culture, a new modernism still unborn but in the wings? Or did the Bolshevik Revolution really completely destroy that possibility forever? Since you already mentioned the revolution, how it affected the Silver Age and when it ended and how, maybe we will also speak about the influence of the Silver Age on the later artists. The first person who comes to mind here is Joseph Brodsky, but I bet there are much more.
Most writers, they continued to write poetry, they continued to write novels, they continued, painters continued to paint, and so on and so forth. But many of them, they were completely discouraged by the fact that hedonistic lifestyle inadvertently led to the Bolshevik Revolution. So they were not entirely sure that they wanted to continue in the same vein. Vladislav Khodasevich, for example, he conceived a project which he called Necropolis, which consisted of several articles that he wrote in the form of obituaries that were dedicated to various representatives of the Silver Age. And basically, he had to wait for quite a long time. He started with Nina Petrovskaya because conveniently she died. She committed suicide very early on. But then he had to wait for the last representatives of the Silver Age to die to finish his collection. But in every essay, he makes one and the same point, how out of date, how obsolete all these people were, that he could no longer understand them, that maybe they were super talented people, but they were flowing against the against the tide, that they were just drifting in the wrong direction. So the Bolshevik Revolution, basically the Marxists and the Silver Age representatives, they were grazing on the same fields. They were reading the same books. They were admiring the same composers. They were taking part in various presentations. Many revolutionaries, well, Trotsky, he wrote his famous book, Literature and Revolution. So he positioned himself, like Stalin later, in the role of a literary critic. So for him, It wasn't the actual battles somewhere, but what happened in literature was the dire proof of revolutionary events taking place. It's impossible just to stop something. Scenes continue to flow. And that's why I was asking, how do we know that this or that period came to an end? With modernism, it is more or less easy because literary critics and literary historians, they allow modernism to continue well into the late 1930s, and they use the beginning of World War II in Europe as its conclusion.
Mm.
Well, Virginia Woolf, she committed suicide at the beginning of World War One. So should we say that her death is the ultimate proof that modernism came to an end? But Nabokov, who is a representative of Russian, European, and American modernism, he definitely continued to write until his death in the 1970s. But it's, I think, the way we want to see certain phenomena does not mean that that's how this phenomena existed in real life. Many people are upset that the Silver Age is called the Silver Age and not the Golden Age of Russian poetry. I'm talking about poetry and literature because the Silver Age is primarily manifested its different features in literature. And although arts in general will also flourish, and music, you name it. I don't know.
Yeah.
Have I answered your question?
No, that makes total sense. Yeah, I agree. And when you talk about the Silver Age, many
Oh,
notes that
I'm sorry,
yeah.
I forgot to say many people were disillusioned that the Silver Age is called Silver Age because there were infinitely more writers, infinitely more artists that came of age during that period as compared to the so-called Golden Age, which has Pushkin, Lermontov, Tolstoy. If you want to stretch it to Dostoevsky, then there will be 4 or 5 notable names, but most people just say that it ended with Pushkin, that the Golden Age is Pushkin, and that's it. So the Silver Age should be the Golden Age, and Pushkin should be the Silver Age as the predecessor of this magnificent blooming of arts and sciences and philosophy and everything.
Mm-hmm. Why so many writers and poets of the Silver Age turned to mysticism and sort of esoteric subjects? And was it also the case for other forms of arts during the Silver Age?
I think it characterizes every period of uncertainty. There was enormous uncertainty, and World War One was in the air. And after the revolution of 1905, which lasted until 1907, many Russian intellectuals they felt dwarfed by the political events. The people whom they liked and whom they wanted to protect and fight for, they were not acting the way it was expected. Then there was the Russo-Japanese War that ended in Russia's defeat. I mean, the beginning, the first third of the 20th century was so full of political and social turmoil for Russia that people were just swimming in the sea of uncertainty. So all the scenes, they were so unpredictable. And with Akhmatova, if you look at her attempts at presenting Russian history as a straightforward line, she didn't know where to start. And at first, she started with the Russo-Japanese War. So the 20th century, according to her, started in 1904. Then she decided, no, 1913, then 1914, then 1917. And basically her picture started to expand until it included almost every political and social event of the 20th century. And some people criticized her for being so unselective, for being so accommodating.
Mm-hmm.
Again, this was the feeling that I cannot forget this or that person. I cannot forget this or that event. And that's why we know so much about the Silver Age at this particular moment.
Mm-hmm. The last question I'll take today, I think it's pretty interesting. Do you connect the whole peak era of classical ballet in Russia and the influence of Diaghilev, Stravinsky, etc., in bringing the influence of the Silver Age to the West? So were these the main channels or something else? Do you think that Diaghilev and Stravinsky, in many ways, and Russian dance brought the Silver Age to the West, or it happened earlier and through different channels, literary, for example, or visual art, paintings?
Russia always sees itself as lagging behind, as being secondary, because symbolism was born in France, not in Russia, but then symbolism became a very powerful movement after certain poets like Brusov, they read Fleur de Mal, and then they started to write their imitative poetry, which very soon became highly original and very, very popular. I think it's always a problem with Russia because they sort of look up to Western models, to Western ideas, and they feel that they need to catch up. But with Diaghilev, he was simply, I think he was disappointed with the reception of his ideas in Russia. So he relocated to Paris, but Parisians were equally not ready to receive Stravinsky Rite of Spring, which was a total shock to Diaghilev because basically everything was done properly. He invited the best painter who was also an esoteric painter, Nikolai Röhrich, to come up with his stage design and beautiful costumes. And the music was, I think the music was seen as very disturbing by Parisians because they could hear the beginning of World War I in it. I don't know whether it is our understanding, whether it is something that we see in it nowadays with the benefit of being removed from that particular period. But it really, when you listen to it now, you see how this music might have felt as extremely emotional and disturbing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, well, Russian Impressionists, they all studied in Paris. So they brought back the ideas how to use brushes, how to experiment with light and so on and so forth. But then they came up with something that was so different from the French models.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you sort of see it over and over again.